What's up, guys? My name is Fari, and I build systems that remove bottlenecks within businesses. And I've been documenting my builds since the 1st of June 2025, going all the way up to the 1st of June 2026. And in today's video, we're going to be going through why I don't trust motivation, but rather trust systems, and how I'm actively using this as fuel to go through those times where motivation is not there. So, in today's video, we're going to be going through the core premise, how I'm actively think about this, and why the use case for this even exists. And then we're going to be going through my core thinking, basically my thinking process in terms of how I am tackling this as well, and also some insights as well, and an example flow, basically how I see the system functioning as a just an example flow, and ultimately how that can be applicable as well. And then also just finally just taking a look at the outcome, basically the outcome as a result from thinking through systems rather than motivation, and using those as somewhat of a moat to get through those times where motivation is not there. So the core premise of this is that motivation fades, and I think this is one of the things that is super apparent. Or it may not be always apparent, but for me it was super apparent in times where I realized that, hey, I might be feeling motivated in this specific point in time, but that motivation ultimately fades, and discipline can crack as a result of that. You can say, hey, I want to do 75-day hard, for example, and when that motivation, that initial jump to say, hey, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do 75 days of hard each and every single day. But then once that initial motivation fades, and then your discipline starts leaking as a result of that, and then ultimately you get to a point where you're feeling down and you're feeling sad that, oh, I told myself I was going to do this, but I ultimately did not, simply because it was motivation and not discipline, and also building somewhat of a system that ultimately allows you to get through those times where you don't feel that motivation. And also understanding that the system can scale, basically scaling your level of impact in terms of how you're approaching things that you're doing. So taking the systems approach, in my opinion, is ultimately the approach of saying, hey, I'm going to take this systems approach of understanding what are the mechanisms that I ultimately need to use, and use as leverage in order to get to my end result. And this ultimately scales as well, so it lets you have a higher level of output as well, and also allows you to continue to do what you've been doing in the beginning. And that's why most people depend on emotional spikes to build momentum. They depend on, hey, I'm going to feel good, I feel good, and this is what's going to ultimately bring this momentum, and not realizing that it's ultimately a result of discipline, which takes time to formulate, that ultimately gets you to your end goal. And understanding that it's not all emotion in terms of the things that you ultimately can do that leads you to your end goal, but rather it's an approach of taking systems and scaling that level of output as well, that ultimately allows you to then scale and get to where you want to get to. But that means that emotion isn't leverage, it's having structure that ultimately creates leverage. Having more structure in terms of how you're approaching, say, hey, I want to reach this XYZ goal, and yes, you may have emotion to say, hey, I'm gonna I'm super pumped to build XYZ, and I'm gonna do all these things, and I'm gonna make sure that my emotion ultimately is a result for why I'm chasing that goal, but not realizing that this ultimately does not create leverage. It's ultimately structure in the manner that you're ultimately having this end objective. And that is why I want to focus on building around this system, and understanding how this system behaves, rather than saying I don't want to build on based on how I feel, but rather how the system ultimately behaves, and how I can also scale that system that ultimately gets me to my end goal. And this ultimately led me to my core thinking, which ultimately came as a result of understanding that if I'm going to build a workflow, I ultimately ask, is this workflow going to be able to run if I'm having a bad day? Simply because, if you have emotion, tied to it, you're not going to, do it, or you're going to be less likely to do it if you're having a bad day. And you want to somewhat remove that emotion and implement structure that ultimately allows you to then get to the main objective for what it is that you're building on a day to day. And understanding that if the answer is no, then the system system isn't strong enough. Your emotions may not be strong enough to ultimately get you to where you need to get to. And yes, motivation is good, 100%, but it ultimately fades. And that is where you need to take a systems approach, or at least I take a systems approach where I say, hey, what are the mechanisms that I can ultimately pull that ultimately scale as well, that ultimately get me to my end goal? And understanding that these systems are built to absorb inconsistency. And this is such a big line because us as humans, sometimes we fall trap or prey to being inconsistent. It's something that we always have to fight off. And if you don't have mechanisms or strategies in place that ultimately allow you to then pull certain levers that allow you to then somewhat absorb this inconsistency, then you're not going to be able to scale what you're doing. And understanding that chaos ultimately turns into predictability, and not through discipline, you ultimately are able to understand that this isn't through discipline but through design. How are you then able to design this system such so that it ultimately gets you to your end goal? And understanding this simple concept really changed the needle for me. Understanding that I need to have somewhat mechanisms and ways that I'm thinking to absorb the times where I may fall prey to inconsistency, and building on top of that, what are the levers that I can ultimately pull to ultimately get me to my end goal that also absorb times where I may not feel like doing certain things, or just getting stuff done. And I think this is one of the most important things that I want to outline in this video, is having mechanisms that ultimately absorb inconsistencies, because those inconsistencies are somewhat going to creep up. It's just, the question then just becomes, how can you then absorb them and have mitigation plans or mitigation strategies that ultimately combat that? And that means I'm ultimately optimizing loops, stability loops, instead of motivation spikes. So how can I ultimately formulate these stability loops that keeps everything consistent, and understanding that templates ultimately run the machine instead of tasks? How can we ultimately have a templatized approach? I don't know if that word even exists, but I'm just going to use it anyway. A templatized approach that ultimately runs what we're doing, and checklists instead of memory. Are we doing XYZ in this procedural manner, and how are we getting this done, instead of relying on memory? Because we're not going to always remember what it is that we need to get done if we solely just leave it up to remembering through memory. And that is why also focusing on dashboards instead of decisions, basically creating these dashboards that ultimately allow us to then track these metrics that we can place a lot of emphasis in, to say, hey, this specific dashboard shows our metrics from top down, what it is that we also need to improve, because those that is ultimately data that ultimately fuels how we think and move into the future. And without that data, we're not able to fully have the big picture that ultimately allows us to then scale and figure out where we're messing up, so that we can ultimately improve as well. And running those feedback loops is also super important, to understand that, hey, this specific task or this specific template isn't running in the manner that is most efficient. So how can we combat that? Are we relying so much on memory? And if so, what are the things that we're forgetting, such so that we convert our memory checklist into somewhat of a physical checklist that we ultimately use to make sure that we're getting the stuff done that we need to ultimately get done. And that means this ultimately creates somewhat of a flow where we ultimately have your morning systems checks, where you're ultimately checking, hey, how is the system functioning? Is it up to scratch? Are things actively moving in compounding fashion that ultimately allows us to scale our level of impact? And then through that, we ultimately take a look at the pipeline data. We say, hey, this pipeline data is looking in XYZ manner, and understanding the different data points that we can then use this to ultimately improve and refine what it is that we're doing. And just running these feedback loops that ultimately powers how we scale our level of impact through systems, such so that we're not ultimately relying on motivation, but rather building a system that ultimately allows us to then somewhat, absorb, those inconsistencies. And also understanding that through this pipeline data, fully once we fully understood it and we understand how it functions, we can then auto update KPIs so that we're ultimately, getting closer and hitting those KPIs that we need to hit, whether it's on a day-to-day or a weekly basis, just making sure that we're ultimately hitting the KPIs that we need to hit. But that ultimately comes as a result from understanding that, hey, this is somewhat of a process flow from morning checks to pipeline data, and how that ultimately feeds how we auto update KPIs. Are we above KPIs? Are we below KPIs? And how can we ultimately, have means that ultimately gets us closer to our KPIs if we're not there, and also exceed them as well. But that also means that, we're not, using tasks to queue, basically to pull from yesterday's progress. We're using these tasks to queue the pulls from yesterday's progress, and not asking, hey, what should I do today, since it's already defined, which is one of the most important things as well, to basically understand that, hey, we don't want to ask the question, or if we're asking the question, what needs to get done today, then we already have a problem. It's about stopping those problems or those inconsistencies before they even take hold. Before you even realize it, we need to be making sure that, hey, we're not asking the question of what needs to get done. We need to make sure that we're having a level of clarity on a day to day, that we already know what needs to get done tomorrow or the day after, that we're ultimately understanding that, hey, this is how this process flow works, and it ultimately means that we're defining the things that we ultimately need to define in order to make sure that each and every single day everyone is aware of what it is that they need to get done. But that also means that motivation never enters the equation, but rather just execution at scale, focusing on how can we execute what we're doing but at scale, and also just understanding that, hey, we want to make sure that motivation never fully enters the equation, because once it enters the equation or it creeps in, it ultimately creates an emotional reaction towards what it is that we're doing. And like I said, motivation fades, but ultimately taking this systems approach that ultimately absorbs, those inconsistencies, ultimately allows you to have longevity as well in the things that you're doing, as well as the systems that you're building. And that means you can ultimately use this as a moat to ultimately execute at scale. And I think this is one of the, like I said, it's really important to be able to take your inputs and through the processes ultimately, scale that such so that your output is 10x what you've put in, and ultimately making sure that you're refining these process and fully understanding what are the mechanisms and levers that you ultimately need to pull in order to refine your system. And this ultimately results in the outcome of having, or understanding that, motivation gives burst but systems give momentum. And this is where momentum, in my opinion, ultimately comes from. It comes from having this structured series of things that you do on a day-to-day that ultimately creates this momentum. It's not, hey, I'm having a bad day, so now I'm not going to do the thing. No, it's just do the thing that needs to get done, and have means and strategies in place that ultimately allows you to then, somewhat absorb those inconsistencies that ultimately may form, even without you noticing. And that means once you understand that, you stop building from inspiration and start building from inevitability. And understanding that once you start building from inevitability, from things that you've been able to gather through data, and then ultimately use this as somewhat of a moat that you can predict what's going to happen next. Say for example, you record 10 videos for 10 days straight, then you ultimately know that, hey, between those days where you may have a lack of motivation, or you may have a bad day, you can ultimately take a day off and you'll still be running the machine. How can you ultimately basically run the machine without you or your emotions being super attached to it, and having somewhat of this absorbing thing or block that ultimately allows you to absorb these inconsistencies, and fully understand understanding how to ultimately, not use motivation, because that's emotional, but rather, building the momentum through systems and strategies that you ultimately have through understanding the inflows, the processes, and the outflows. And I like to think about, certain things, or most things, in terms of inputs, processes, and outputs, because so many things, ultimately come as a result of those compounding inputs. And how can we ultimately identify those inputs that we're putting in, such so that we can somewhat predict and recognize the patterns that ultimately come, from the output, and also using this as a mode to ultimately scale or 10x the level of output that we're ultimately having, and making sure that we're also tracking data, which is also super important. And yeah, if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to check out my newsletter. It's the first link in the description, as well as if you want to connect with me, links are basically just below that. And I will see you guys in the next video.